Hello and welcome. My name is Madeleine Longoria Garcia, and these are our other stories. Okay, y'all, we are officially starting season 2, and I will admit I miscalculated my timeline between these two seasons. I definitely thought I had a week break in between the first season and the second season. I totally do not. So I hit the ground running with season 2, started all the prep while we were still launching episodes of season 1, and have been just recording really for the last couple of weeks to do season 2. And we are still recording episodes over the next couple of weeks to bring you this full second season of content and conversations. So season 2, we are sticking with themes this season, and we're going to talk about Hispanic Heritage Month because today, September 15th, is the beginning of Hispanic Heritage Month. And I am going to go into exploring that a little bit. But before we do that, I wanted to share with you what you can expect from this season. So Hispanic Heritage Month is September 15th to October 15th, and it's 5 weeks. So because we have 5 weeks and I have more than 5 episodes to share with you all, I'm actually going to drop 2 episodes each week this season. So we will still have 10 episodes for this season, but you will have 2 each week. So we will drop episodes on Mondays and on Thursdays every week. So we are delivering content twice as fast this season. And yeah, I really just wanted to fit this within Hispanic Heritage Month, but also give you a wide range of conversations to listen to. I had so many different people just come to mind immediately. There are people who I haven't even reached out to who I would love to come on under this season, but they're going to come on at a different time and they're going to have amazing stories to share with you. And I promise it's not going to be completely divorced from this idea and this theme of Hispanic Heritage Month. Just had to kind of decide who I was going to reach out to, and then also who was available in this period of time to sit down and have a conversation. Because we are recording for about an hour and a half, but we have a conversation before we start recording, and we usually have a little conversation after we stop recording, because these are folks who I'm just catching up with too. So I'm asking a lot of folks who are coming on this podcast. I'm asking a lot of their time, I guess, but that also plays into whether or not they are going to come on the podcast during a specific season. So with that, this first episode, I'm going to share a little bit about my own identity and how I have, just seen, or how I can reflect on how this piece of my identity has impacted me in different ways throughout my whole life, and how I bring it with me into every single space that I occupy, whether I know it or not, right? But before we get into that, I want to say you're going to hear me throughout this season kind of grapple with calling this month of observing these cultures Hispanic Heritage Month, and giving folks different options of how to name this month of celebration and identity. Because there are several other words we can use here, right? And the word Hispanic doesn't always sit right with me. And I know a lot of other folks who I share this identity with, they also don't really agree with this term Hispanic to define us as individuals and this massively diverse group of people that fall under this umbrella of quote unquote Hispanic. So you will hear me say Latino, Latine, so gender neutral terms like Latine, Latinx. native to the Americas, indigenous to the Americas. These are different terms and phrases that I am using, and truthfully, on a personal level, I never identify as Hispanic. Like I don't. I would rather identify as Latino or Latine or indigenous to the Americas. That's my personal preference. I want to talk about what is the difference? Why does it matter? So this part, part of this episode, I'm really just going to dig into like these different terms and what they mean. Hispanic quite literally means of or from a Spanish-speaking nation. Period. Full stop. That's it. Of or from a Spanish-speaking nation. So that does not include, in Latin America, Brazil, a massive nation. It does not include Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana. I also have a question mark around Belize because the official language of Belize is English, and the vast majority of the people in Belize speak English or some sort of Creole language. I actually had a really good friend in high school whose family was from Belize, and she's Black, and she didn't identify as Hispanic or Latino at all. She was like, no, I'm Black. And that was it. She's like, I don't speak Spanish. I'm not Latina. Like, she's like, no, I'm Black. So that also, I remember as a high schooler, that made me think of these identity names and markers in a different way. Hispanic does not include all of those other nations. It includes Spain, right? So folks from Spain are Hispanic. But an interesting caveat here is that there is a Spanish-speaking nation in Africa that does not, quote unquote, qualify to be a Hispanic nation because of cultural differences. So now we're introducing this whole other concept of like, well, you're Hispanic because of the language spoken, but now there's also this additional qualifier of culture. But I have to say, the culture from Mexico versus the culture in Chile are very different. The culture in Mexico versus the culture in Spain, very different. So that doesn't quite make sense that like the cultural differences are the reasons why Equatorial Guinea does not fall under this broad term to group together Hispanics. These are some of the reasons why I have an issue with this term Hispanic. There's also this other piece to that there is Hispanic to me is an effort toward the erasure of indigenous cultures and languages throughout all of the Americas. Because you are saying these are quote unquote Spanish speaking nations when there were other languages spoken in these nations far before Spanish became their official language. So that's another piece there. It's like, well, what about all of these indigenous languages and cultures that have existed in these places for centuries? And then really at the core, it is a term that creates homogenization of a very diverse group of people, a very diverse group of cultures and nations. And it doesn't sit right with me. It feels like I've been assigned this identity name because it's easier to think of all of these people from these very different places as one thing. And the same, truthfully, can be said for the term Latino. And this is a term that personally I identify more with, but I do still see those issues of creating homogenization of a very diverse group of people. Again, we're talking about when we use the term Latino, it is a person of Latin American origin or descent. So not language focused, right? Geographically focused. So Hispanic is focused linguistically, except for Equatorial Guinea, and Latino is focused geographically, so of Latin America. And for whatever, all of these different historical, geopolitical, all of these different reasons, that starts in Mexico and south. This is Latin America. Mexico, south through Central America, all the way down to the tip of Argentina. This does include Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, Belize, right? And it does not include Spain. But I do see the issues with this term Latino as well, which are similar to the issues of the term Hispanic. Like I said, creating this myth of homogenization of all of these different cultures and languages and people and nations when they, again, are vastly different from each other. There is also, because we've created these terms, there's this false belief and this false assumption around the world that Latinos are a monolith, and we're not. We are so different from each other, and it's great. Like, it's so cool. I love learning about the cultures of different nations throughout Latin America because it's new, it's different for me. The food is different. The indigenous languages are different. The music is different. Just the way of being. It's such a diverse part of the world. And we are doing a disservice to lump all of these nations together. There's another term here that I want to bring in that is usually much narrower, and I feel like it's not used as commonly because it is a much narrower definition, but it's something that I also do identify with. And this is the term Chicano. What is Chicano? Chicano is a person of Mexican descent, specifically a person born in the United States of Mexican descent. And there was a whole Chicano movement that happened in the United States. It started in the Southwest and then kind of spread from there. It started, I believe, in the 40s, went on through the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. I was reading about this, and they're saying that the Chicano movement slowly died out, or I don't want to say died out. It slowly stopped, I guess. The movement didn't gain momentum past the mid to late 70s. And I don't really know, the details of all of the different actions. I will admit, like, I haven't read a ton on the political state of the Chicano movement, but I want to share that as a person of Mexican descent who grew up in Los Angeles in the 90s, the Chicano movement was still very much present then. That identity, people identifying as Chicano, was definitely something that I experienced all around me in my childhood. I would go to art galleries and events and all of these spaces where people were talking about their identity as Chicano and Chicana. I'm going to say this is still a very prevalent and present movement within the United States. What I've read is that over time, so again, it started in like the 40s and 50s, over time, Central Americans also started to embrace this term. I personally don't know very many Central Americans who do use this term to identify themselves, but admittedly, it's not something that I bring up in conversation that often. But this is another identity marker within Latin America that I just wanted to identify and define and talk about here as well. And it's one, as I said earlier, that I identify as. This is an interesting conversation because I remember the moment where it all clicked with me that I was like, oh, I am actually all of these. I am Chicana, I am Latina, and I am Hispanic, even if I don't like to use that term, because part of my family are descendants from Spain. My family speaks Spanish. My family is from Mexico. We are Latino. My family's from Mexico. We are Chicanos, you know? And I grew up in Los Angeles, again, where that movement was very prevalent for decades. I first had that realization, though, when I was in college. It was something, and throughout this podcast, you'll probably hear me bring up my college days quite a bit because that was a pretty pivotal moment for me and my personal development in understanding my identity. And so I had this moment of realizing this when I was sitting in a class. And I remember my professor, Monica, I cannot remember her last name right now. And it was a Latin American Studies class. And we were talking about defining these different terms in this class. And she was posing the question to us as students of, does it make sense to use these terms? What do they mean? Like, how do we use these to define this massive group of people? And I was, I think, the only brown woman in that class. As I've said on previous episodes of this podcast, I went to a very white university in the Pacific Northwest. And that was normal for me to be the only or one of the only non-white people in my classes. And it was pretty common for me to be the only Latina in my classes. And so here I am sitting in this Latin American Studies class, which was my minor, and this conversation is happening, with my professor, with other students. And I'm sitting there like trying to think about like, how do I relate to these? How do I identify with each of these words? Do I identify with them? And in real time, I had started talking about this to my professor in front of the class. And in real time, I had this discovery of like, oh no, all of these are me. Like all of these terms do fit into my identity, or maybe my identity fits into the umbrella of all of these terms. It was an interesting moment because I think, as I've alluded again in other conversations on this podcast, like that's not something I really thought about a lot in my upbringing in Los Angeles. And this is where I'm going to get into my own identity development with these terms and under this concept of celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. Growing up in Los Angeles, I grew up in a very diverse community. And my parents were divorced and lived in different parts of Los Angeles and the general Los Angeles area. And so in one area, and where I went to elementary school, I was surrounded predominantly by Filipinos and Armenians. That's just like what the majority of the people living in that area, their cultural backgrounds and their nationalities. Where my mom lived, it was predominantly Chinese. Where a lot of my friends lived were in predominantly Latino communities. So this was Highland Park, way before it got gentrified, way before it was a desirable place in Los Angeles, back when it was inexpensive and super Latino there, and people would say it was not a good part of Los Angeles, which was false. It was a perfectly fine and safe part of Los Angeles. It's just, what people think when it is dominated by a culture that they're not familiar with. So yeah, places like Highland Park, Glassell Park, Boyle Heights area. Yeah, so the surrounding areas, again, the places where I hung out, really strong Latino culture, but also surrounded by so many other cultures and languages. Like, this is just how I grew up. And it wasn't until I left that I realized how unique it was to have grown up in Los Angeles and experience all of those things. And meeting all of these people, all of these other students at my university who did not have that experience and had no understanding of multicultural spaces, really. It was very interesting for me. So growing up, it didn't really feel like an exceptional thing or a unique piece of my identity to be brown, to be Latina, to be Mexican American. Everybody around me had connection to a different nation and culture and language and place than the United States and Los Angeles. I will say all of Los Angeles is not like that. I have met people from LA who grew up in very homogenous cultures, who grew up in very specific spaces where they were not exposed to cultural and linguistic diversity. And so I have to say, like, a lot of my upbringing was also unique within Los Angeles. And I think that's because of not just where my parents lived and where I went to school, but also because my parents were intentional about taking me to different places. My mom would take us to art galleries and cultural events and free music concerts in the park all over LA all the time. That's how I grew up. She would take us to Dia de Muertos celebrations at an arts and cultural center. We were just immersed in this all the time. So it was because of their efforts too that I had such a unique experience, or that I had that, multicultural upbringing. And my friend group in elementary school, I was friends with other Latinos, with Filipinos, with Armenians, with Persian, Iranian, Italian. Yeah, those were all kids that's only my elementary school, who were like my good friends in elementary school. And then in high school, I had I had a group of friends that we were all Latinas, except for the one woman whose family is connected to Belize, which again, she did not identify as Latina. She identified as Black. And Filipino also, Guatemalan, all sorts of different backgrounds. Again, super, super multicultural schools that I went to. And I'm grateful for that. That definitely, in a way, made me realize I was kind of naive when I went to college, because I just assumed everybody had been exposed to these different cultures. Everybody grew up hearing different languages. Everybody listened to different types of music and had experienced different types of foods and all of this stuff. And suddenly I'm in the Pacific Northwest at this private liberal arts university, and I am one of a very small percentage of not just Latino students, but just like students of color, quote unquote, non-white students, which was the total opposite of what I grew up with. And suddenly I'm having conversations with my peers where they're like, yeah, there was one Asian family in my town that I grew up in, and that I lived in until I came here to this school. And this is like so much more diverse than where I grew up, and just being shocked by that. Where people who had never had Indian food before, or had never had Thai food or sushi or anything. And it was wild to me, right? Like it blew my mind. And yeah, I think that I was very naive and didn't understand why people didn't understand me. I think that was a big piece, that I suddenly felt like the majority of my peers didn't understand me because they had never been exposed to somebody like me. And I felt different. I would say growing up as a high school student and in elementary school, like I always felt kind of different. I tell people I was kind of a dork, in school as a kid. I was pretty nerdy. I did well in school. I did extracurriculars. Like I was in choir. I was in the musicals and the plays. I did sports. I was a runner. I did cross country and track. So I did all of these things and I was good at school. But in college, it was like I felt so different simply because of my external presentation, right? I have this curly hair, brown skin, and I stick out so much. I stuck out so much. It was weird for me. And again, like people didn't really understand where I was coming from. They didn't understand any significant part of my culture. So it was kind of weird for me. And I'm going to share here, because this comes up as a memory for me almost every time I talk about this within the context of my experience as a university student. The first time that I felt very blatantly othered as a college student by my peers was my freshman year. And I'm pretty sure it was the first semester of my freshman year. And I had 2 roommates. So there were 3 of us in one room. And they were both white. One was actually from Los Angeles, but grew up in a very different environment than I did in Los Angeles. She was from Pasadena, and like a specific part of Pasadena. Anybody who's familiar with Los Angeles knows Pasadena is very different from the rest of Los Angeles. I love it. It's great. It's beautiful. There's Pasadena's fun, but very different culturally speaking from the rest of Los Angeles and from like the Los Angeles that I was also familiar with. I did spend time in Pasadena. One of the choirs that I was in growing up was based in Pasadena. Whatever, that's a whole other thing. So one of my roommates was from Pasadena, California, and my other roommate was from Alaska. Again, both of them are white. And one day, there are 3 girls, okay? 3 girls living in one room. It got messy, right? Like it got messy all the time. Specifically, like our hair was everywhere all the time. And I remember one day cleaning our dorm room, and I had moved a bunch of stuff out of the way and was like wiping down my desk, cleaning up my desk. And then I was sweeping the whole room. And I think maybe we had a vacuum. I don't know. We had a rug in the middle of the room. I remember that. And I was vacuuming the rug or cleaning it, whatever, sweeping all of this stuff. And one of my roommates walks in and she's like, "Why are you cleaning the room?" I was like, "Oh, it was dirty." And she's like, "I feel like you clean the room so often." I was like, "Well, it gets dirty. Like our hair is fucking everywhere. Like it gets dirty." She was just like, "Well, I guess you're Mexican, so you're used to it." It being I'm used to cleaning, which was a wild thing for me to hear. And it made no sense to me. And I remember being so taken aback by that this is what she thinks of me. And this is not just that, but this is what she thinks of Mexicans. And I will be completely honest and say that fucked me up. And that was the first time as a college student that I felt so different from everybody around me. And I felt so othered by my peer. And I will never forget that. And I tried to not take it personally. And I didn't say anything back because I was so shocked by that. I didn't know what to say back. And I still, maintained a friendship with her throughout the rest of my 4 years at that school. But that moment was a big moment for me in realizing that they see me as different and not in a good way necessarily. And I had friends at that university who were also not white. And we would joke about these dynamics and just things that would come up throughout our time at that university. It was something that we were able to be lighthearted about in some way, at least. And it felt nice to at least feel like we could be lighthearted about it. That college is also where I got my first barista job. I was a barista at one of the cafes on our campus. 2 of the managers, when I was hired, were also Latino, one of whom I became very good friends with. I was actually already friends with her before I started working there. And her family has roots in Peru. And I remember her joking about me and her. And then I think it was a year later, we hired another woman who was like Chinese, Hawaiian. And our joke was, with the 3 of us, are the diversity of diversions. Diversions was the name of the cafe. Diversions Cafe. So yeah, we're the diversity of diversions, the 3 of us. This is a completely student-run cafe, so our staff was like 25 people, maybe more. So 10%. We're talking about 10% of the staff being like, we're the non-white people who work here. But yeah, like I said earlier in this episode, my time as a student at that university became a really pivotal moment, a really pivotal period of 4 years where I started to kind of dissect and peel apart my cultural identity. And it was triggered by feeling so different from the people around me and realizing that they also saw me as so different from them. Yeah, it's like a bittersweet. I have a bittersweet relationship, I would say, as an alumnus of that university. I have a lot of really amazing memories there. I look back at my time there and I'm amazed by myself and the things that I did. I was definitely an overachiever. I spread myself very thin, and I did a lot of really cool shit by spreading myself so thin. I don't regret it, right? Spreading myself so thin, but it is something that I sometimes wonder, if I had backed off a little bit, what would my experience have been? That, again, was a very unique time for me. And I think because I felt so different there, part of me didn't really want people to know. Later in life, I think this is where I started to not want people to know straight out the gate that I was Mexican American. And this showed up in different ways throughout my life, where when I would travel to different countries, people never really knew where to place me. So I spent a semester studying in Vienna, Austria as a student. When I was in college, my major was in business and leadership, and I had two minors because, again, overachiever. One was in Latin American studies and one was in music. So I went to Vienna, Austria because I could get credits for my music minor and my business major. I remember when I was there, there were several incidents where I was just walking around the city. Vienna's an awesome city. I was just walking around the city and people thought I was Italian when I was there. I remember being very confused by that. I was like, that's weird. People think I'm Italian here? Italian people are white. And then I'm like, oh no, wait. Italy also has quite a bit of diversity in culture and people and all of that. And so people definitely thought I was from the southern part of Italy. And yeah, that was an interesting experience for me to realize, like, oh, they don't assume I'm Latina. They think I'm Italian. Okay, interesting. I think also there it was where people thought I was maybe Brazilian. And I will say that has come up in earlier parts of my life too. It wasn't the first time that this came up. I remember actually being in high school and one specific friend who was a very dear friend of mine who I've lost touch with, they could not place me at all. And she also was like, I don't know, are you Brazilian? Are you Indian? Are you Puerto Rican? Are you, like, she just like couldn't, she's like, I don't know, are you Egyptian? She could not place me because of the way I look. So this is something that had happened to me previously too. I also had friends growing up who thought I was half black, half white. This is another, and I'm realizing this now, this is another theme throughout my life. And then this happens to me when I'm a college student in Europe. There were also other weird incidences in Europe where I remember being on a train to Poland with three of my friends, who the three of them were white. And the four of us were sitting on this train from Vienna to Krakow. And this man who's walking by just like stops and stares directly at me. The four of us are sitting together. The four of us were all talking together too, like laughing, whatever, joking around. And then this man just stops and stares directly at me. And I couldn't even make eye contact with him. As soon as I realized he was just staring at me, I looked away and didn't know what to do until, I don't remember if it was one of the two men who were my friends who was sitting with us. I don't know if one of them did something or said something, or if the man just like moved on his own. But it was a very, very strange feeling. So there were these things that started happening in my life that I kind of wanted to shy away or not talk about my Latinidad. This piece of my identity that I had grown up around, that I had grown up to be proud of and embrace, was something that was suddenly the root of these very uncomfortable experiences. And even beyond uncomfortable, they were scary. Like that man on the train, that made me feel unsafe. And it felt, there was this time where I realized I just decided to shy away from my Latinidad and not let people in on that piece of who I am. And I did it in subtle ways. One was just like not so readily sharing that information with people. One was, there was a period of my life where I would just be like, yeah, just guess where you think my family's from. because I used to get that question all the time. I still get that question, right? But like, I would just let the person, I would kind of like play this game with the person who was asking me that question. And maybe it led them to looking kind of foolish or silly, which was a little bit of the point. And also, it fed me information of how can I maybe become a little bit of a chameleon in different spaces? You know, throughout my life, and again, these are stories that I will share over time throughout the existence of this podcast, but I have had the opportunity in my life to visit and live in several different countries. And one of them was Spain. So there was this time, you know, I was living in Spain, and there people thought I was Moroccan, which was interesting to me because suddenly it's not a Latin American identity, it's not a Latino identity, it's not a Hispanic identity or culture that I am being related to, but it's a North African identity, it's Arab. And that was super interesting for me to experience as a person living in Spain, that like, oh, people also think that I look Moroccan. Okay. And when I was in Morocco, people thought I was Moroccan. They would come up to me and start speaking to me in Arabic, and I had to change languages. And in Morocco, I specifically chose to pretend I was from Spain instead of from the United States because I wanted to blend in a little bit more. Everybody in Morocco speaks like 3 or 4 different languages. It's pretty amazing. But yeah, so I spoke Spanish the whole time with a Spanish accent because I had just been living in Spain and picked up their accent while I was living there. So I've had these weird opportunities to kind of, again, be a chameleon in different places, not necessarily to the culture that I'm existing in that point in time, but to other cultures around the world. There was a time, even when I was traveling through Southeast Asia, that somebody who I had met in Thailand was like, "Oh, you kind of look like you could be from Southern Thai. You look like you could be Southern Thai." And I actually pulled that off once in a weird, just like a weird, random, unintentional sequence of events. But I was not charged to enter one of the temples in Thailand because they thought I was local. And anybody who's been to Thailand and in a lot of Southeast Asia, there's a local and a foreign price for a lot of these places, not just temples, but museums, a lot of these different, tourist attractions. And so this one temple, it was free if you were local, and you had to pay however much if you were a foreigner. And they didn't even try to charge me. They just waved me right in. So it's interesting, right? To have these experiences where what's the word I'm looking for? To have these instances where I am ethnically ambiguous enough to kind of get by in some regard, or to temporarily adopt a different cultural identity. And yet I always look different in the eyes of many people. And I always look other in the eyes of many people. Yeah, those are the examples of these kind of, I don't know, small ways that I let myself blend into different cultures or adopt different identities temporarily, kind of just to see what would happen. And also, there was a very distinct period of time in my life where I decided, my last name, Longoria Garcia, there's not really arguing that I am anything but Latina with that last name, right? That name, paired with my first name, though, Madeleine, that doesn't really give you any hint at my cultural background. So I decided at a certain time that I was not going to share my last name with people. And I did this primarily, actually, I kind of did this everywhere. I was going to say I did this primarily in my work, but I did this everywhere. And so I went by Madeleine LG, just my initials. I would sign up for stuff, I would register for events, I would do all of this stuff, and I wouldn't put my full name, my full last name down. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that there were probably several reasons for that. One was that I would face a lot of spaces where I quite literally could not fit my whole last name into, the character spaces allotted for the name registration or whatever it was. And so that wouldn't fit. So I didn't want to choose one over the other. So I would just write LG. Another was I didn't want to give away that piece of my identity to strangers because I saw how people kind of weaponized that against me. Again, going back to the way that my roommate treated me because of my Mexican identity, the things that other people would say about me because of my Latina identity, and being told, like, oh, you have a little bit of that Latina fire and spiciness in you by a fucking old white man. That's not the thing I want really anybody saying to me, but certainly not an old white man. And so I was like, if I just don't let these people know what my last name is, they don't have that fuel, in a way, to say something rude and racist at the end of the day, is what it is. So I didn't want to give people that fuel. Third, I wanted to confuse people. I recognized this, that there was a part of me that wanted to confuse people because they couldn't figure out where the fuck I was from. And I wanted to see them try to figure it out on their own without asking the right questions. Because if people just asked the right questions, they would figure it out pretty quickly because I would share that information with them. But it's very interesting to see people go through this process of trying to place other humans, categorize other humans. And I understand and I know and I recognize it's a very human thing for us to try to categorize things, to organize them into boxes and spaces so we understand where they fit, quote unquote, in our brains. And there were so many times where I would experience that, and they were doing it in a way that was rude and rooted in racism and rooted in prejudice and rooted in othering me. And I did not want to give them the opportunity to make it easy. I wanted them to struggle through that process. And if I gave them my last name, it made it pretty fucking easy. So I wouldn't give them my last name. Yeah, this is, a piece of this one arc of my life and my identity as a Latina, as a Mexican American, as a Chicana, in and outside of the United States, and how I've carried that with me and how it's impacted maybe the way that I move about the world. And at the same time, when I was studying abroad in Austria, I sought out the Mexican consulate to find where's the Dia de Muertos celebration in this city. I know there aren't a lot of Mexicans here, but there are some. There've got to be some. Where's that celebration happening? And I found it, right? They told me where it was happening, and I went to it. When I was living in Spain, I met another woman from the United States whose family is from Mexico, and she and I connected and bonded and, had a friendship throughout that whole time. And that was the entry point for our friendship, is just connecting on our ethnicities. When I lived in Australia, which is a whole other story in and of itself too. Same thing. I actually this memory popped up in my photos earlier this week, is I found this Mexican Independence Day celebration in Melbourne And so I went to that with my friends and I painted my face and all of this stuff. And there was live music and food, and it was such a celebration. It's like I sought that out because I wanted to know, where is this happening, you know? And where's the Dia de Muertos celebration happening? And so it is something too that I've carried with me and sought out these spaces that feel familiar, that feel safe, that feel comfortable, and that feel like a piece of home. Everywhere I've lived, everywhere I've been, I've sought that out. And it's something that there's just this feeling for me when I would find those spaces and those communities that it just felt like, okay, I can relax. I can exhale. I can relax. I can be myself here. There's something about that. Again, everywhere I've been, I look for it. And it's one of the first things I've looked for in a lot of the places that I've lived, trying to find the Latino community, trying to find the cultural events that are celebrating Mexican Independence Day or Dia de Muertos or whatever other holiday. Primarily those two are the ones that I look for. Welcome to season 2. This is maybe a piece of how these conversations will go, but every guest is going to bring their own perspectives. They're going to share whatever piece they'd like to, whatever piece they feel comfortable with sharing related to their Latinidad, their Hispanic heritage, their experience as someone who has roots in Latin America, living in the United States. I'm pretty sure every guest we have lined up for this season is living in the United States. I'd have to go back and double check the list, but I'm like 99% sure. And really how this has shaped their lives, how this piece of our shared identity has shaped their lives. I think we're going to find things that, I relate to a lot of these folks on and things that I don't, right? Because we're also coming from very different life experiences, childhoods, growing up in different towns and cities throughout the nation, having access to different spaces and experiences and people. And so it's going to be focused on this theme. And I know that there is going to be a lot of diversity in the conversations that we have and how folks share these pieces of themselves with you and the stories that really come from and shape this piece of their identity. So I hope you will join us for the full season. We have some awesome people coming on. I cannot wait to introduce them to you. These are all people who have come into my life in one way or another, and some who I have never had a video call with before, some who I have only ever communicated with via video calls, some who I've known for several years, and some more recently than that. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing this all with you and giving you the opportunity to hear these different stories from folks and them sharing how this piece of their identity shapes the way that they show up, not only in their present life, but in previous versions of themselves. Because that's what I've shared with you today. And that's only some of it. We will be back, you and I, here at some point during this season 2 to talk about more things. For now, this is where I'm going to leave it. So thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to our other stories on whatever app you are listening or watching this podcast on. Please rate the podcast, leave a comment if you have the time. I'd really appreciate hearing from folks. You can leave a comment on Spotify and on YouTube. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok. It's at ourother.stories, and engage with us there. I know I told you all I was going to launch the newsletter last week. It didn't happen. I did not have the motivation to finish that all up, but it is on my list, and it's this month, the month of September. We got 2 weeks left of this month is when I'm launching the newsletter and making it live, and the Patreon and making that live. Those are other ways coming down the pipeline where you can support and interact in different ways. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. My name is Madeleine Longoria Garcia, and these are our other stories. You can stream this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, AntennaPod, YouTube, and anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. Have a great day.